Okay, good morning to all of you. My name is Lucio Vinha de Souza. Irina has kindly introduced me. I think that several of you know me. I have worked with this country for close to 15 years of my life. Among other capacities, I used to be the head of the Russia-Belarus desk at the Ministry of Economy of the European Union. Now, what I'm going to be showing to you on my 45 minutes that I have left is going to be a discussion of the sensitivity of countries in the CIS to a Russia-Ukraine shock. Now, before that, just to provide you a small indication of what is the work that we do for the region, we currently have ratings in 8 of the 12 CIS countries. Only 3 of those are investment-grade territory, namely the commodity producing and energy exporters Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Russia. All the other guys are in what we call spec-grade territory, including this particular country. Okay, the point of this exercise was to try to evaluate the potential sensitivities of the CIS countries as a whole through stresses in the largest economy of the CIS region, the CIS. The countries of the CIS, they interact with Russia by several different dimensions. This is not a surprise to any of you here. They interact by trade, they interact by FDI, they interact by remittances, right? So, first thing that we do in terms of this exercise is to look how sensitive, how vulnerable the individual CIS countries are to those Russia exposures, quote unquote. Now, first, let's look at trade. As we had in our previous presentation, countries of the CIS still trade a considerable amount with the Russian Federation. That actually is much less than it was 10, 15 years ago because of 2 different processes. If you look at the CIS as a whole, you have a process in which the western borders of the CIS region have progressively integrated in financial and economic terms with the European Union. So the size of the CIS as a trading partner, and here we're essentially talking, you want me to speak? Okay. Right, sorry for that. I tend to wander away from my desk. Now, as we can see here, you have significant degrees of exposure to Russia as trade partners, but they are actually geographically very concentrated. In practical terms, what we are talking about is exposure in terms of trade, which is considered considerably higher in terms of the CIS Western members. For the Central Asian ones, actually this is not the case. There are 2 reasons for that related to the process that was indicated before. In trade terms, the western part of the CIS has progressively integrated with the European Union, while the Central Asian ones effectively have been progressively integrated with China. The practical implication of that is that the relative importance of Russia is being eaten away by 2 different regional processes. This said, there are countries which still have very significant exposures trade-wise to the Russian Federation, and those are the guys here. Belarus, to no one's surprise, is on the top of the scale. Close to half of your trade is with one single country, namely the Russian Federation. This also has implications in terms of the importance of trade with Russia in relation to GDP, right? That's not something that comes automatically from the share of trade, because you can be a very open economy, you export a lot, or you can be a very low export-intensive economy. Belarus is on the first camp, right? So when you look in terms of the average exposures via exports to Russia, Belarus has over a full fifth of your GDP. But that's only one of the dimensions of exposure. Another one is foreign direct investment. There are countries which are significantly exposed to Russia in terms of FDI inflows, not only Belarus in this case, but countries like Uzbekistan and Moldova, in which the share of FDI that comes from the Russian Federation can be anything between 40% and 2/3. Now, and that's something that we can relate to the previous presentation, that is not as relevant in terms of GDP, simply because, on average, the countries of the FDI, they actually receive very little foreign direct investment. The reason for that is because you have persistent questions related to investment climate virtually across the book of the CIS. right? So this is another exposure, but it's not as high GDP-wise as the trade one. Another one that also relates in terms to the relative importance in terms of GDP, which you can see is actually very small, between 0.8 and 1.2 on the countries which are more exposed to Russia FDI-wise. Now, another type of channel of transmission of Russian stresses, positive or negative, happens to be remittances, right? That's extremely important for a subset of countries in the CIS, namely Central Asian ones, mostly speaking. If you are in Tajikistan, a country in which I was a few weeks ago, virtually half of your GDP you receive in terms of remittances from the Russian Federation. It's a massive number. You also have other countries in which this type of exposure is really quite considerable, right? But again, this is effectively very regionally concentrated, right? We're effectively talking about a bunch of countries in Central Asia. Moldova is a country that has a very high share of remittances to GDP, but that's not actually Russia, not fully Russia, right? A significant portion of this happens to be European Union, and countries in the European Union which are not necessarily the ones that you would associate with. I'm a proud Portuguese citizen, and I clearly remember having Moldovans working in building sites in the olden days in Lisbon. Right? So roughly only about 60% of this is actually Russia, the rest of it is European Union. Okay, so we do all that, and then to try to effectively have a grasp on the level of exposure that the countries have to quote-unquote Russian stresses, we build a heat map in which we try to order them according to the relative brackets of those exposures, right? So what do we get? What we get is this here. We try to have all those countries ordered in terms of their relative exposures. To no one's surprise, because of the massive importance of remittances in terms of GDP, Tajikistan comes there on the very top. This is followed by another Central Asian country, the Kyrgyz Republic, and then two countries which have roughly similar exposures once we adjusted for the share of remittances in Moldova that comes out of the European Union, which are Belarus and Moldova. The channels are different, right? When you have an exposure which is essentially via remittances for Tajikistan, for the Kyrgyz Republic, in Belarus is a combination of trade, right? And in Moldova is a combination of trade and remittances, right? So think of this in terms of ordering, but it's also important to understand the composition of the channels. Okay. Now, this is something that is relevant for you as a country when you look at the buffers. You have a shock, right? And you have something on the other side that you can use to counteract or cushion that shock. If you think of Russia as a, let's say, external sustainability shock, and I'm not trying to be funny here, that is an intuitive way in which you can try to measure that, which happens to be one of the indicators that we produce in Moody's, which is our so-called external vulnerability indicator, which can be defined as the following. Essentially, what we are trying to do here, and we do this for our rated countries, is how much money you have in hard currency and how much you are expected to be able to disperse during the course of next year, right? So that shows how vulnerable you are to the sort of external shocks. Let's take a look here. Now, again, the guy here, almost off the charts, happens to be Belarus. This is the amount of money that you have to pay during the course of next year compared to how much money you actually have. That's 100% here. Obviously, the message that comes out of this is that a country like Ukraine and a country like Belarus, and even a country like Kazakhstan, to someone's surprise, actually have potential repayments due within the next 12 months, which are almost exactly equivalent to how much money you actually have in hard currency, or a multiple of that. So you go into this direction in the scale, the more vulnerable you are to the sort of external shocks. Now, but that's something that is relatively unscientific, right? So what we try to do is to, in a naive type of estimation, look at the vulnerability of a country to a GDP shock out of Russia with a small multivariate equation. we do this now for all the CIS countries. The AVIs we only produce for our rated universe, so now we do for all the CIS countries. So, basically what we get is the following. Now, that is the elasticity of GDP to a 1% GDP shock in Russia. In other terms, if Russian growth falls by 1%, what happens to the GDP growth of those guys? As you can see, you have a very significant difference in terms of distribution, which again is parallel to geographical patterns. Guys in the western part of the CIS tend to be much more exposed than the guys here. More than that, the average exposure here, the average elasticity is around 1, which implies an almost 1-to-1 shock. 1% growth reduction in Russia, on average terms, is equivalent to a 1% reduction in growth in CIS countries. This is a very high level of exposure. But the only countries in the sample for which you actually have a statistically significant exposure, so where the elasticity is actually significantly different from 0, are those 5 guys here. The guys from this side of the distribution, so the guys in Central Asia, they are either with a very low level of elasticity, so their GDP moves very little once you have a 1% GDP shock in Russia. And beyond that, this is non-significant. So not only this is small, but it's statistically non-significant from a regression point of view, which means that those guys here are the only ones that are actually affected. And when you do the average of the elasticity of GDP growth for only the significant sample, so those guys here, from Azerbaijan onwards is non-significant and therefore non-different from 0. For these guys here, the average is 1.4. In other terms, a 1% GDP shock out of the Russian Federation has more than 1% effect in terms of GDP of these people. This is essentially driven by those 2 guys here. And if I were to do an average that is GDP weighted, it would be even higher than 1.4, essentially because the largest GDP country, Ukraine, is one of the largest affected here. And this is not related to what happened in the past 2 years. We use a long-term series to derive those elasticities. Now, okay, so just to provide you with a benchmark, we did a similar exercise for the European Union countries, right? But with a more structured model, so we were capable of incorporating into our results all types of second round effects. And we did that with very harsh scenarios for the Russian Federation. Not only we are estimating here the effects of a GDP shock out of Russia, we are also simulating here a energy cut supply, right, for all the countries of the European Union. The implications of this modelization exercise that we did for the European Union is that a Russia shock effectively affects the European Union very, very mildly, even when we take into account what amounts to a very significant energy disruption shock, right? Effectively what we're saying is that Russia stops exporting all the energy that is sent to the Union via Ukraine, and we model how this affects the European Union. Even when we do that, the effects are relatively quite small. And they are essentially driven not by real and financial channels, they are driven by expectational channels. Because you think that tomorrow is going to be worse than today, you household, you company, you don't invest, you don't consume. The results are therefore largely expectation. Even when you do that, the relative importance of a Russia shock is much, much smaller for the European Union than for the CIS, by an order of magnitude. In other terms, a Russia shock can be 3 to 9 times stronger for CIS countries than it is for the European Union. And that's when I'm using the all CIS average elasticity of growth, right? If I were to use this only for the 5 significant guys, so the Western CIS, the difference here would be 1 to 14. So really much harder hit by Russian shocks than the European Union itself. So from a European Union point of view, a relatively optimistic story. Okay, now, what I have just told you so far is effectively a short-term cyclical story, right? You have a stress here, this spans out to the other guys. However, you have very significant long-term dynamics which we have operating throughout the CIS countries. We did another modelization exercise in which we tried to separate the cyclical story, so the temporary one, from the permanent, the structural one. And the results are quite interesting. Now, one thing that we have is that the structural components of the deceleration, which you do have almost virtually across the emerging markets, right? So you have very large emerging markets now that will have either very slow growth or that have downward growth trajectories all the way from China to Brazil, is the following. Emerging markets have a share of permanent structural slowdown in terms of growth, which is about a quarter. For the CIS, this is much larger. It's over a third. So the permanent component on the growth slowdown that you have across all CIS countries is much more permanent than for the other guys. Because of obvious things, right? All the way from aging to investment climate, infrastructure constraints, etc., etc. Not only this is much higher than for emerging markets in general, it's much higher for individual CIS countries. If I were to show you how this pans out for individual CIS countries, you are going to see that the share of the structural, so permanent growth slowdown, leaving aside the cyclical story, which is what I was telling you before. Russia stresses you have to assume that are temporary, therefore they are cyclical, right? This is the permanent structural one. The share of the structural component of the slowdown can be anywhere between 40% to 2/3, depending on the CIS country that you are talking about, including the Russian Federation itself. For those that were paying attention to the underlying reasons for the downgrade that we put out for the Russian Federation 2 weeks ago, it was not really the Russia-Ukraine story. It was this, right? That was actually the main reason for our downgrade 2 weeks ago, the distant worsening of the medium-term growth prospects of the Russian Federation, which are not only in Russia, virtually across the board, especially on the Western CIS countries. Okay, thanks you for your attention. For those of you that have access to our publications, which I strongly advise to all of you in this room, all the things that I just showed to you are available on the set of presentations here. Look forward to your questions.